So, this is going to be a strange one. This video will probably be one of the least Russian videos in this series. This is for the simple fact that for the majority of the history of the region, it was not only not in the Russian Empire, but completely outside its sphere of influence. However, the information in this video is very important to understanding why modern Kaliningrad is treated as an integral region of the Russian Federation. If you've enjoyed the content thus far, think about liking this video and subscribing to see more like it. Enjoy. Hello and welcome back to All About Russia. My name is Andrew and today we're going to be looking at the westernmost part of the Russian Federation, the Kaliningrad Oblast. The Kaliningrad Oblast, literally meaning the city of Kalinin, is located to the west of Russia proper, separated from any land border by over 300 miles. It is in the Kaliningrad Economic Region and in the Northwestern Federal District. It is the 77th largest federal subject at 5,800 square miles in size, making it larger than the nation of Brunei. As of the 2010 census, it has a population of over 1 million people, making it the 49th most populous part of the Russian Federation and more populous than the Union of Comoros. The Kaliningrad Oblast is Russia's only exclave, for reasons we will explain later in this video. As an exclave, it borders no other part of the Russian Federation, but does share a land border with the nation of Lithuania to the north and east, and Poland to the south. It faces the Baltic Sea to its west. The Kaliningrad Oblast is a very flat region, with the highest point being Mount Dozor at a whopping 231 meters tall. For context, the Uluru in Australia is 100 meters taller than this, and you can walk up it. The name comes from the Russian word for watch or patrol, and unusually, this is a very recent name, having only been given it in 1945. Unfortunately, I have been unable to find out the previous name of this hill, so if anyone does know, please put it in the comments below. The longest river in the Oblast is the Pregolia, at over 76 miles in length. The etymology of this river is much older, and is thought to have come from a Proto-Baltic word meaning something along the lines of swollen. As mentioned, much of the Oblast is flat. This has resulted in over 16% of the land being devoted purely to agriculture. Nearly 20% consists of woodlands, with the remaining land being a mixture of rolling hills, urban areas and beach. The Oblast is divided into 13 administrative districts, with the Kaliningrad city as its own administrative centre. The flag of the Kaliningrad Oblast is made up of a tricolour of red, yellow and blue. The red represents the Soviet past of the area, the yellow representing Baltic amber, historically a luxury commodity from the region, and the blue representing the Baltic Sea. In the top corner stands a fort representing hospitality, with the monograph of Elizabeth the Great underneath it. This is because Elizabeth the Great was the first Russian monarch to control the region, even if it was only for a couple of years. The flag was adopted surprisingly late, on the 9th of June 2006. Before this time, the region did not actually have a flag, for reasons we will explain later in this video. As well as the westernmost part of the Russian Federation, the Kaliningrad Oblast is also one of the earliest, being an hour ahead of Moscow Standard Time and in its own time zone. Surprisingly, despite only being an oblast, not a republic, it does have its own anthem, which is playing right now and will be included in the description below for those of you who are interested. Human settlement in the region of Kaliningrad dates back to 15,000 BC, with evidence of the Neolithic Sedmar culture found dating from this time. Who these original people were, we may never know. But what we do know is that a Baltic presence was evident in the region from at least the 3rd century AD. This is actually not that surprising, as much of the northwestern part of Eastern Europe was historically inhabited by Baltic people, the ancestors of the modern Lithuanian and Latvian people. One of the earliest mentions of the region come from the Roman writer Tacitus, who recorded the Aesti living in the region. This is believed by some historians to be the old Prussian people, as Aesti sounds very similar to a Baltic word for lagoon. The early history of the region is spotty at best. It's generally agreed to have fallen under the control of the Gothic kingdom in the 6th century, but may well have been part of the earlier Hunnic dominions. What we can say for certain is that by at least the 9th century, Viking travellers were recording the region as an important trading hub on the Baltic Sea. Whilst Prussian tribes had hunted and fished in the region for hundreds of years, they had also extracted amber from the ground to be used in jewellery and decorations. The amber trade was an important one and had risen to prominence during the time of the Roman Empire. But it is only in the 8th century that we hear mention of Kaup, an important trading city on the Curonian Split. The land of the future Kaliningrad Oblast was founded on an area which historically was known as Prussia. This name derives from the ethnic group that lived there, a Baltic people called the Prussians. It should be noted that this region was divided amongst several different Prussian tribes at this time, yet the fact an important trading city arose would lead to both economic wealth and centralization. The amber trade put the ancient Prussian people in contact with many other nations, which in turn affected their relation with both Prussia and the Prussians. These were not a united people, and at least 6 different tribes were evident in the region from at least the 10th century. The lands of the future Kaliningrad Oblast particularly were inhabited by the Sambians and the Scalvians. The early history of the region is spotty at best. What we can say with certain is that by at least the 9th century, Viking explorers and traders were recording an area of great wealth on the Baltic with plenty of amber to be traded for. Both Viking and English sources mention Kaup as an important trading post for amber during the early medieval period. This was so much so that it was actually sacked by the Viking King of England Knut in 1016. Nevertheless, most of the mentions of the region are positive, and one of the side effects of this lucrative trade is it put it into the orbit of the Hanseatic Trade League. This was a northern European trade league that carried goods all the way from England to Novgorod and everywhere in between. As a result, in some of the graves of wealthy Novgorodians, amber has been found likely heralding from this region. The development of this amber trade enriched all of the Prussian tribes. This in turn led to attempts of centralization and monopolies forming. Notably, one such city attempting to get a monopoly on the trade emerged near the Prego River, a little village called Twangste, which would one day become Kaliningrad City. One of the earliest nations to take a serious interest in this region was its modern southern neighbour, Poland. Polish interests in the region were more substantial than just trade, and from 997 AD, Catholic missionaries began to arrive in the region, attempting to convert the heathen Prussians to Christianity. This was met with limited success, and while some tribes did embrace Christianity at least nominally, the majority did not. The Poles were not trying to convert the Prussians to Christianity out of the goodness of their hearts. There were realpolitik reasons behind this. Firstly, the Poles and Prussians shared a land border, and the latter were very fond of raiding their southern neighbour, particularly the Duchy of Mazovia. As the Prussians became more centralised, these raids became more damning, and thus creating Christians was a way of stabilising the border. Secondly, this posed a unique opportunity for Poland to exert influence in a very valuable region. If they could control the amber trade, well, so much more the better. Whilst there were consistent efforts from Poland to convert the Prussians, it should be noting that a real zeal of conversion came about in the 11th century. From the 11th century, there was a real push to crusade against the northern peoples of Europe. This was a precedent that had been set during the First Crusades. Crusaders fighting for God against heathen peoples who had rejected Christ could secure land against them until such time as they embraced the one true God. This meant that a very effective way of gaining land was simply to crusade against people who had land but weren't your religion. Crusades against the Finns, the Wends, and to an extent the Karelians had already taken place from Germanic nobility taking land and populating the area with their own people. Thus, in 1166, in response to Prussian raids, the Polish king Boleslav IV, with support from the Pope, launched a crusade against the Prussians and promptly got his arse handed to him. This crusade was a complete failure. One of the main issues was the Kaliningrad region, whilst flat, was very boggy and ideal terrain for guerrilla conflict. Sufficiently chastised, there was little the Polish crown could do, as Prussian tribes periodically raided their northern holdings. Due to the fact that the Prussians had defeated the Poles, including an order of knights specifically designed to conquer them, the Polish king appealed to the Pope. At this point, the Prussian tribes were beginning to be a serious threat in the north, beginning to encroach on much of the northern territory of modern Poland, and so the Pope in turn declared a crusade against them. Despite this, the Polish soldiers still struggled to make any headway against the powerful Prussians. What they needed were soldiers who had experience in fighting the northern pagans of Europe, and so they turned to the Teutonic Knights. The history of the Kaliningrad region can roughly be divided into three segments: Prussian, German, and Russian, and it is with the Teutonic Knights that this second epoch starts. The Teutonic Knights were a German-speaking order of Catholic knights originally formed in Okra, but present in a variety of European kingdoms in the 13th century. From 1227 right up to 1274, the German knights would sack, burn, and plunder the region, shattering the Prussian tribes' power. Those Prussians who were not outright killed in the fighting were often rounded up and marched into the rivers for a mass conversion, which in essence led them to be an underclass in their own lands. The power of the Teutonic Knights was awesome, and in 1233, the first of many castles was erected in the region. This castle, overlooking that important trading village of Twantster, was named Royal Mountain after the royal king who had invited them there, or Königsberg in German. This was for the majority of its history the name of the Kaliningrad city, and I will alternate between using these two terms in this video. By 1274, the region had been thoroughly pacified and was dominated by the new German nobility. A steady stream of soldiers, followed by traders and their families, did move into the region. The Prussians did not, of course, accept this status quo and revolted twice against the Teutonic Knights. Both uprisings were put down brutally, and by 1274, Prussians were firmly entrenched as an underclass in what was once their lands. With the support of the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor, the lands were incorporated into the state of the Teutonic Knights. It should be noted at this point that Lithuania to the north was still pagan, and thus there was much fighting in the rest of the Baltics and Northern Europe. It should be noted that the crusades against the northern peoples of Europe continued for many years after this, but for the scope of this video we are going to be focusing on the Kaliningrad region. In 1286, Königsberg was given a town charter, and this prompted further growth. With the region being pacified, a more steady stream of traders, soldiers and their families moved into the region. Primarily focused in the safer south and west of the region, it was only after 1274 that large-scale German immigration began in the north and east. It should be noted that this would constitute genocide by modern terms, but for the period of the time this was a great thing, and many rejoiced at the pacification and security now it brought to the lands. As mentioned before, from this point the Teutonic Order formed the Teutonic Order state. This was a monastic state which owed allegiance only to the Pope. This was originally a massive boon for the Polish crown, as it gave them essentially free soldiers to the north to fight the pagan peoples harrying their lands, without any claims to said land long term. The often plundered Mazarovian lands were secured, and with Teutonic control, Polish merchants were able to directly access the rich amber. However, crusading knights are still people, and very quickly some territorial issues began to come to light. The Teutonic state did not set its capital at Königsberg, first of all, originally settling it at Marienburg to the west in 1308. Trade flourished in the newly conquered lands, with more German immigrants moving to work the fields, farms, amber mines and fishing villages in the region. With this new security came wealth. By 1340, they were members of the Hanseatic League, and 1343 saw the Polish-Teutonic border fixed under the Treaty of Kalisz. The Teutonic Knights had arrived in the region and very quickly become successful. Every year, things improved for them, until finally, they began suffering from their own success. The Teutonic Knights had originally been invited to help defend Christendom and convert the pagans in the region. However, in 1386, the last pagan state in the region, the Kingdom of Lithuania, unified with Poland and converted to Christianity the following year. This posed quite a big question for the Teutonic Knights. But why were they still needed? For those unaware of medieval hierarchies, Knights Templar are ultimately working at the behest of the Pope, but would often be subservient to another higher power such as a duke, a king or an emperor. Having conquered Prussia pretty much off their own backs without much Polish help, the Grand Masters of the Teutonic Knights did not exactly feel like giving the land up to the Poles. The influx of German immigration had given the region a German character, and during its 200 years of fighting, the state had managed to control several other regions that, by right, were part of either the Kingdom of Poland or Lithuania. Very quickly, these land disputes began to be raised. When the unified Polish-Lithuanian state began to raise these land concerns with them, the Teutonic Knights did not take it very well. In 1409, fighting broke out and would repeatedly happen for the next 50 years between the Polish-Lithuanian realms and the Teutonic Knights. While the majority of this fighting did occur outside of the modern Kaliningrad Oblast, it did have a powerful effect on it. The ultimate defeat of the Teutons in 1466 led to some profound changes. Firstly, the knightly state lost its western holdings entirely, incorporated into Poland proper. This meant the residents living there had to accept Polish rule or move further eastward towards the modern Kaliningrad region. The loss of land to the west forced the focus on the Kaliningrad region. Königsberg had been the capital since 1457, when Marienburg was deemed too vulnerable, and this also meant an intense Germanification of one of the last holdouts of Prussian Slavic culture. By the end of the century, Prussia was wholly German. Secondly, the Teutonic state was now a royal fiefdom, and the king could decide who it was given to. Another change was in leadership. Whereas before, the Teutonic Knights, led by their Grand Master, made all decisions, now powerful landowners and merchants of the regions had a say in what would happen. What this meant in real terms is that the Teutonic Knights lost their sole influence and leadership and now found themselves having to compete with German landowners who found themselves the subject of the Polish crown. An interesting side note here, this is the origin of the German Junker class, something that would be very important later in its history. Prussia had transitioned from a crusading state into a royal duchy, but its ambitions were not at an end. The cultural differences between the Poles and the Germans led to a disagreeability throughout the time under the Polish kingdom, as well as a growing religious divide as some of the Teutonic Knights sought a reformed version of Christianity. Now both the Teutonic Knights and the Prussian Confederacy, who had originally sought out Polish protection and overlordship, were seeking independence through alternative means. Military hopes had been dashed when an uprising in 1519 had found international support lacking, and the Holy Roman Empire actually mediating a truce to focus their efforts on the Turks invading to the south. In 1525, both the Kingdom of Poland, the Holy Roman Emperor, and the Royal Duchy of Prussia were all Catholic states. Yet despite this, that same year, the Duchy of Prussia converted to Protestantism. The Polish king accepted this happily, and the Holy Roman Emperor put up no disagreement. At a time where people were being burned alive for praying the wrong way, why would a king or an emperor accept a subordinate committing such outright heresy? It's weird, right? Because the blood of the covenant is not thicker than the water of the womb. The Polish king Sigismund was the uncle of the Grand Master of the Teutonic Order and Duke of the Royal Duchy. By granting him inheritable rights, he was, in essence, giving the duchy to his own family in perpetuity. What's more is this same family controlled neighbouring Brandenburg in the Holy Roman Empire, another Protestant area. The Protestant revolutions in parts of the Holy Roman Empire were causing absolute chaos, and the emperor was not in a position to demand that a foreign power go back to Catholicism. For a bit of context here, the Protestant Reformation was beginning to get into full swing, and it was causing absolute pandemonium in the German states of the Holy Roman Empire. It should be noted at this point that the Polish king Sigismund was famous for having a very laissez-faire attitude towards religion, and thus, with a single stroke of a pen, did a new epoch of Prussian history begin. By 1550, the city of Königsberg had a population of 14,000, with a small Jewish contingent, and was a thriving region as part of the Polish Golden Age. Trade with Muscovy, Sweden, France and England grew as land was cleared for farming and bogs drained. The Union of Lublin, that saw the creation of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, also saw Prussia treated as a de jure part of the Polish kingdom. This was bad news for the Prussians, as they began to be treated more and more as a province rather than an autonomous region. Despite this, neither the German language nor culture were infringed upon, and Prussia became a centre of both German and Protestant culture in Northern Europe. This period also saw a reinforcement of serfdom by the future Junker class, with native Prussians and Lithuanians reinforced into their servile positions. The Königsberg region is a fantastic example of some of the craziness of inheritance politics. In 1618, the last of the Hohenzollern line died out, and the Duchy of Royal Prussia passed to its nearest male descendant, who just so happened to be the electorate of Brandenburg. This put the region into a peculiar position. On the one hand, its head was the elector of Brandenburg and could help nominate for imperial succession, but that same person was also Duke in Prussia. Amazingly, they had to specify that he was Duke in Prussia, not of Prussia, in case it offended the Holy Roman Empire. Absolutely ridiculous. This naturally divided their loyalty between the Holy Roman Empire and the King of Poland. Thus, when the 30 Years' War broke out, it dragged Prussia into the conflict, but thankfully spared its land and much of its people the horrors of war. Prussia and the Königsberg region was surrounded by Poland, and thus it was completely spared much of the devastation that afflicted Germany, able to continue trading with its nearby neighbours as it had before. The nearest neighbours, in fact, were also friendly Protestant states, so in some respects this war even helped economically. As a safe Protestant state, this was very attractive for many Protestant refugees who migrated to the area in drips and drabs, bringing their skills and experience with them. But by having two loyalties, they also had two commitments. And in 1655, the Second Northern War broke out. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth crumbled under an allied Russo-Swedish force. As the Elector of Brandenburg also held Prussia, they managed to spare the region war by arranging a non-aggression agreement with the Swedes, even being invested with the title Duke in Prussia from the Swedish king who was claiming the Polish crown. By 1657, the Poles managed to make a bit of a comeback, and this brought a great opportunity for the Prussians. The Poles were desperate for the Swedes to be weakened any way they could, and thus in return for breaking the non-aggression pact between Prussia and Sweden, they agreed to grant the Duchy of Prussia their own independence, becoming a sovereign state. As this gets very confusing, let's do a little recap. At the time of the Second Northern War, the lands of Prussia were owned by the electorate of Brandenburg, but they were also loyal to the Polish king as a subject. What the Polish king was offering was to release them from this oath of loyalty and a united state with the Electorate of Brandenburg. Frederick William quickly accepted this offer, and not only did he now have independence, he started using a new title, Duke of Prussia. Now this may not seem like a very important step, but it should be noted that in the Holy Roman Empire, other than the Kingdom of Bohemia that had existed at its inception, no one was allowed to declare themselves king or duke, as it was an affront to the emperor. By taking this title, Frederick William was establishing himself as a Protestant German alternative to the Holy Roman Emperor, and a source of power in Europe. The power balance in the Holy Roman Empire had shifted since its inception in the 10th century, and Prussian arms and soldiering were considered some of the best in Europe. The fact their land had been spared the ravages of war, whilst everyone around them had been embroiled in it, left them as a considerable player in Northern Europe at this time. This was not lost on the Holy Roman Emperor, and in return for an alliance against the French, Holy Roman Emperor Leopold I elevated Frederick to King in Prussia. Note that we didn't say King of Prussia, because you couldn't be a king if you were in the Holy Roman Empire, but you could be a king in lands outside of it. As Prussia had never been a part of the Holy Roman Empire, he was allowed to be king in Prussia, but not king of Prussia. I swear to God, I can see why Napoleon wanted to get rid of it. This raised the region from a duchy to a kingdom, and brought the international prestige and renown that Frederick I craved. Fighting in Germany and Switzerland brought ever more migrants to the region, swelling the German population further, despite both the Electorate of Brandenburg and the Kingdom of Poland getting embroiled in wars. The isolated position of the future Kaliningrad region made it a refuge for many German Protestants. This gradual but constant immigration led to the Königsberg region becoming a cultural heartland for North German Protestantism. It should be noted that it wasn't just Germans moving to the area. Jews had been permitted to settle in the region since 1680, and a substantial permanent community had existed in Königsberg itself by 1704. This community was of course a part of the Jewish diaspora, and in future years would help to make the Königsberg region something of a safe haven for Jews fleeing persecution elsewhere. With the movement of people also comes the movement of ideas, and the Königsberg region found itself as a centre of Enlightenment thinking. Famously, it produced profound thinkers such as Immanuel Kant and Johann Herder from its university. By and large, the changing geopolitical situation in the 18th century benefited the region immensely. Russians first enter our story in 1757, arriving, quite fittingly, as conquerors. As opposing forces in the 7 Years' War, the Russians invaded the region in 1757, remaining until 1762. It is from this occupation that we get the monograph on the flag, Elizabeth the Great being the monarch at this time. The Russian occupation was short-lived, and with the decline and division of the neighbouring Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, Prussia grew in size and rank, Frederick becoming the King of Prussia in 1772, much to the annoyance of the Holy Roman Emperor. By the end of the century, the Duchy of Prussia had evolved into the Kingdom of Prussia and stood as one of the preeminent powers of Europe, sharing a land border with the Russian Empire to its east, but also one of the preeminent German states, notably the most powerful Protestant one. Ever since the unification with the Electorate of Brandenburg, Königsberg had played the role of second city, but this would change during the Napoleonic Wars. As Prussia was drawn into the anti-Napoleonic coalitions, the lands that they controlled in German proper were conquered and annexed one by one. In 1807, under the Treaty of Tilsit, the Kingdom of Prussia was limited to its Prussian holdings. This would last until 1812, but it did play an important role in rallying Prussia as one of the heartlands not just of Protestantism, but of German culture and identity. Whilst Prussia was not directly occupied by French troops, it did have to give a portion of its own troops to the Grande Armée. With Napoleon's defeat in Russia, by 1813, Prussian troops had thrown off French shackles as part of the Sixth Coalition, The Königsberg region, which relied heavily on trade, particularly with maritime empires such as the British Empire, had been heavily hindered during the Napoleonic period with the Napoleonic blockade. When Napoleon was defeated, trade boomed again, helping to restore life to the waterways of the region. But it was not the only change that happened during this time. The restoration of the Kingdom of Prussia's borders saw some revision. Prussia was divided into East and West Prussia, with the modern Kaliningrad region falling into East Prussia. This was actually split into two further regions, the Königsberg and Gumbinnen districts. Defeat and subjugation to the French had stirred something in the national consciousness of the German people, and this found its voice in the years to come. By 1824, the population of East Prussia alone was over 1 million people. And as Prussia began to expand and include other German states, this grew ever more so. In fact, the Kingdom of Prussia was growing so quickly that in 1829, East and West Prussia were once again reunited for simplicity of administration. The wars of German unification saw Prussian troops and militarism take hold in other parts of Germany, and gave Prussia something of a prestige centre of the German Confederacy. This nationalism was actually bolstered in 1860, when, in the face of Russian nationalism, many German families began to leave the Russian Empire and return to German lands. Yet despite Prussia being involved in several wars for unification in this time period, the Königsberg region itself was a haven of tranquility. Trade with the neighbouring Russian Empire, Sweden and Denmark crossed the sea, as well as more internationally with the Americas and the British Empire further abroad, all helped the region to grow and develop. As the Kingdom of Prussia expanded into the North German Confederacy, then the German Empire in 1871, much attention was still paid to this region, seen by many as a second or maybe third city of this new state. As the new empire was announced, some revisions were made, and Prussia was once again divided into two parts. If the 19th century had been the era of growth and prosperity for the Königsberg region, the 20th would be for its rapid decline and failure. In 1914, East Prussia found itself in a precarious position. On the border with the rapidly mobilizing Russian Empire, the Königsberg lands were invaded. Whilst early German victories completely turned this around, the situation itself did not dramatically improve. Russo-British blockades of German ports strangled the lifeblood of the region and left it unable to import food and supplies across the North Sea. Rationing was introduced, followed by pressing hunger concerns. Whilst food had been stolen from Poland, Ukraine, and the other eastern nations on the German march ever eastward, it was never truly enough. And by 1918, starvation was a very real possibility for the region. The collapse of the war hit the people in Prussia in a way that not many other Germans experienced. Whilst they suffered the same economic woes as the rest of Germany, the psychological impact was more profoundly felt here. The military spirit of the German Empire had been built on Prussian militarism, a militarism that had now found itself defeated. And this prompted a fairly severe reaction. As other parts of the empire, now republic, began to fall to various communist, fascist, or even monarchist sentiment, Prussia by and large supported the Weimar Republic, even sending free corps to help them put down uprisings in Königsberg city itself. Since the Treaty of Versailles, East Prussia had been a German exclave, isolated between Poland and Lithuania. On the 30th November, this was formed as the Free State of Prussia within the Weimar Republic. By isolating this region from the rest of Germany, not only did it force it to suffer a more severe economic situation, but it also isolated the most militaristic revanchist part of the new German Republic. By 1925, the Prussian Free State was in ideological dispute with the moderate Weimar Republic, and this saw the growth of its own police state. This came about through a combination of Prussian Junker militarism, which had existed since at least the 17th century, as well as concerns of their own internal security against a very real communist threat. Firstly, Prussian Junker militarism had not gone away, and they were now keenly aware of their own vulnerability, both internally in the face of communists and externally in the form of Poland. Unable to rely on the ever-weakening Weimar Republic, a new expression found itself growing in popularity in the Free State of Prussia: fascism. With strong police support, in 1932 Franz von Papen led a coup in East Prussia, bringing the Free State under his direct control. The following year, von Papen helped Hitler become German Chancellor, handing over his established police force and apparatus of the Prussian Free State to him. East Prussia was something of a Nazi heartland. Within the 1933 election, the highest proportion of votes here going to the Nazi Party than anywhere in Germany. As fascism was established, minorities that had been there for centuries began to flee from the state. On the eve of the Second World War, East Prussia stood as a stalwart base of Nazism. When Germany invaded Poland in 1939, East Prussia expanded to include the Zichenau region. This region would be used to establish the death camp of Soldau, where the last Jews of the region were killed in the Holocaust. Despite being the most eastern part of the new German Reich, the Königsberg region had been largely spared the horrors of war, and in 1942 boasted a population of over 2 million people. Yet as the Eastern Front collapsed and the Red Army raced to Berlin, panic began to set in. Since mid-1944, the RAF had been flying bombing sorties over the Königsberg region, levelling much of the armament and settlements in the region. By October, Soviet troops were on the ground. Despite the evident writing on the wall, the Prussian leadership did not allow people to leave the region until the 20th of January 1945. 3 days later, the entire region was encircled. Other channels have done a tremendous job in describing what exactly happened here in the coming weeks and months, so we won't go into too much gory detail here. What I will say is that East Prussia, as a bastion of Nazism, faced the full wrath of the Soviet troops. Estimates range from 30 to 300,000 dead in a 5-month period, from a population ranging anywhere from 200 to 800,000 people. Whilst the Red Army exacted revenge in many parts of German-occupied territory, some of the most atrocious stories do stem from their time in East Prussia. It is a bitter irony that the Königsberg region, which was established on the ethnic cleansing of the Prussian people, was ended with the ethnic cleansing of its own German population. At the Potsdam Conference on the 1st of August, the Allied powers had agreed that the East Prussian region would be given to the USSR and the ethnic German population deported. Set up originally as a special military district, the Königsberg region remained with the USSR, while the rest of East Prussia went to the newly restored Polish Republic. After half a year of lawlessness, in 1946 the region was announced as an oblast and renamed the Kaliningrad Oblast, after famed communist Mikhail Kalinin. Over the next 2 years, over 100,000 ethnic Germans were deported from the region, as steady Soviet immigration to the region was encouraged. Uniquely, the Soviet immigration to this region was almost exclusively Slavic, Russian particularly, giving it a very particular character. This poses two logical questions. Why did the USSR keep this region and not give it to Poland? And why did they exclusively bring in Russians? The Kaliningrad region is rather fortunate in that whilst on the Baltic, it does not normally freeze over during the winter. This means that a navy can act from here all year round, something the Soviet Union were a very big fan of. If they had given such a crucial region to one of their client states, it could have potentially been used against them or denied access at some point. Probably best to keep it as part of the Union. That said, the Soviet Union had tried to give it to the Lithuanian Soviet Socialist Republic during the 1950s, but this had been rejected. This was because the Lithuanian SSR was barely Lithuanian, a large portion of the population having been deported to Siberia during the 1940s. In the mind of the Lithuanian Premier, there were already too many Russians in their republic. They did not want to add more. This touches too on an important point. For the majority of Soviet history, Russians were the majority, and they were seen by some of the premiers as the vanguards of socialism. Thus, they were prime candidates to be transplanted to the Kaliningrad region. But if Lithuania didn't want the region, why not give it to the Polish Soviet Republic? Whilst it's true the region had once belonged to the Kingdom of Poland and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, that had not been the case for about 300 years, and the Polish borders had changed quite recently from what they considered their actual heartlands. In fact, the borders of Poland had been redrawn after the Second World War, and the Poles themselves were having a hard enough time accommodating their new territory. They did not need one with a Russian majority in. Thus, based on demographic fears and military concerns, the Kaliningrad Oblast became part of the Russian Soviet Socialist Republic. Whilst this was technically an exclave, it did not seem that strange at the time. Lithuania, Poland, and Russia were all part of the same communist bloc, and thus travel between the states was not that difficult for the military and the elites. What's more, many regions of the Soviet Union were internally closed to each other, so there was not that strange an idea that people couldn't travel easily between, but the army and Politburo could. The good naval conditions led to a strong Soviet military presence, and neighbouring Baltic became the home of the Baltic fleet. Coincidentally, access to non-freezing Baltic waters also led to a huge fishing industry developing here, bringing thousands of tons of Baltic fish to the Soviet markets. Under Soviet rule, the Kaliningrad region was first and foremost a military outpost, and thus there was little non-military development in the region. Yet despite this, the citizens living here lived slightly better than their counterparts away in Moscow. Their proximity to more westward Soviet states allowed them greater access on the black market to goods produced in those countries. Thus, whilst the standard of living did not rise as high as places like East Germany, the quality of life here was higher than in many parts of the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the Kaliningrad Oblast found itself as a genuine exclave of the Russian Federation. Due to its military importance, the Russian Federation did not want it to go, and the population within largely supported being part of the Russian Federation. This was in large part due to the population being majority ethnic Russians, who had, within the last 70 years, moved to the region. In 1991, the restriction on foreigners was lifted, and the region began to experience some development. Throughout the 90s, substantial investment and even tourism began to appear in the region. Notably, many of these tourists and investments came from the new German Republic. Many of the visitors looking to see the land that their parents or grandparents had been exiled from. To spur this along, in 1997 the Kaliningrad Oblast was declared a free economic area called Yantar or Amber. This kind of worked, and by the 2000s the Kaliningrad Oblast involved in both domestic manufacturing, particularly of cars, as well as international trade with its neighbouring republics. This does stand in contrast to much of Russia, where manufacturing had rapidly declined. As it was in the Soviet Union, so it would be in the new Russian Federation. First and foremost, a military outpost. In 2008, in light of growing tensions with NATO expansion, a fortification of the region began. This would see increased naval manoeuvres, airspace violations, as well as threats of missile basing in the region. As we have seen throughout the history of the Kaliningrad region, it has thrived on both trade and migration to the area. And in present times, it's getting neither. The last big hurrah for the Kaliningrad region was in 2018, where it was one of the FIFA World Cup cities. Since that time, the economy of the region has been blighted by the Ukrainian war. Since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, sanctions have heavily affected the region. These sanctions have made it incredibly difficult to travel both to and from the region, both domestically and for business. Yet all has not been lost. In September 2022, an incredible thing happened. Drawing on the legacy of its Czech king founder, the entire region, by popular referendum, overwhelmingly supported being annexed by Czechia as the Kralovec region. A huge surge of Czech nationalism and patriotism has surged through the region as the Kaliningraders are finally finding their Czech roots. Despite being heavily sanctioned, the Kaliningrad region still ranks as the 49th richest part of the Russian Federation, which kind of tells you something. Before the war, it was home to enormous BMW and Kia assembly plants, as well as still possessing the largest fishing fleet in Russia. Over 90% of the world's amber comes from this region alone, and amber plays an important part of the economy. Traditionally, this was just exported abroad, but since 2014 has been processed within Russia as well. Whilst one of the biggest employers in the region has historically been the military, since the 2000s another industry has been taking off, that of tourism. In addition to the international tourism of many Germans finding their heritage throughout the 90s and 2000s, the Kaliningrad Oblast has become a popular destination for domestic tourism as well. Traditionally, Russians have been quite limited in their travel options, given that their passport is not particularly powerful and the population by and large are not very rich. And so Kaliningrad is an attractive prospect for many Russians seeking a Western experience. This is because for many Russians, the Kaliningrad Oblast is the nearest to the West that they can reasonably get to. Within Kaliningrad city itself, much of the Prussian architecture has been restored, blended with Russian modernity. I actually travelled to this region just after the World Cup, and many of the Russians I spoke to repeated this point, that for them Kaliningrad was an almost Western experience within Russia. Since 2010, the region has been electrically independent, as part of the military security of the region. It is notable that there are no nuclear power plants in this region. This, much like in Ingushetia, is not for lack of trying, more it never seems to work out financially. Unsurprisingly, agriculture is a large part of the economy for the region, with rapeseed and corn both produced in enormous numbers, the largest in Russia in 2018 and 19 respectively. Food processing is also a large industry as a result, and much of the fish in Russia comes from this region. As mentioned earlier, the sanctions and limitations on free travel are strangling this within the region, and it will be interesting to see what the state of the economy will be like once the Ukrainians win the war. But I do not believe it will be a quick recovery. As of the last census, the population stood at over 1 million people, an increase from 2010. Nearly half the population lives in Kaliningrad city, and the region ranks as the 49th most populous part of the Russian Federation. Russians make up over 75% of the population, with smaller communities of Ukrainians and Belarusians existing as well. The remaining 20% is a mixture of several different ethnic groups, all in tiny proportions, including Azeris, Tatars, Jews, Germans, and Poles. As of the 2012 survey, a third of the population are Christian, with the majority as Russian Orthodox. 34% of the population declared themselves spiritual but not religious, with atheism at over 20%. Over 10% of the population did not give an answer. The birth rate on the Oblast is 1.4 children per woman, slightly under the national average. The rate of drug abuse is lower here than the national average, as is the alcoholism rate. The governor of the Oblast is Anton Alekhanov, a mixed Russian of both Georgian and Caucasian Greek descent. He is originally from Abkhazia, making him one of the few governors not born within the Russian Federation. He has been in power since 2017 and is, of course, a member of the United Russia Party. The Kaliningrad region is steeped in history, and this is reflected in what you may find there. Should you visit, you may see the Königsberg Cathedral, a Gothic-inspired cathedral which has hourly organ performances. It also has the tomb of Immanuel Kant, the Enlightenment philosopher, at the rear. The Kurian split is a remarkable piece of nature, showing the Kurian Lagoon on one side and the Baltic Sea on the other. Lastly, the House of Soviets is a fantastic piece of absurdist Soviet architecture, built on the site of the original Königsberg Castle that was torn down in the 1950s. The Kaliningrad Blast is an oddity. It is a remnant of Soviet imperialism that has lived to the present day, yet the people and the region do feel incredibly Russian. Its history is wild and dramatic, and trade has normally been the lifeblood of the region. Whilst crippled now, it will be interesting to see the situation of the region after the Ukrainian war is won. Thank you for watching. My name is Andrew. Up next, the Republic of Kalmykia. Paka!